He thought humiliating her would be easy, but within minutes, that entire room would question everything they believed about strength. The Taekwondo Academy stood at the corner of a busy California strip mall, its glass front reflecting the late afternoon sun while inside. Polished hardwood floors stretched wall to wall beneath bright overhead lights. Every inch of the space radiating discipline and control. Rows of students in crisp white uniforms moved in perfect synchronization, their sharp movements echoing against the walls. Each kick and step punctuated by disciplined breaths. And at the center of it all stood Master Ryan Cole, a man whose reputation alone was enough to make newcomers hesitate at the door, his black belt tied with practiced precision, his posture upright and commanding, his eyes scanning every student with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades earning respect the hard way. Nothing in this room happened without his approval, nothing went unnoticed, and certainly no one unfamiliar slipped in without being measured. So when the door opened with a soft chime and Emily Carter stepped inside, the rhythm of the room didn't stop, but it shifted just enough to be felt. Subtle glances passed between students, movements slowed by fractions of a second, attention pulled toward the figure who didn't quite belong. She wore a loose gray hoodie despite the warm 75-degree afternoon, dark jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers that contrasted sharply against the immaculate training mats. Her hair was tied back simply. No effort to impress, no attempt to stand out. And yet somehow, that made her stand out even more. She didn't rush, didn't look around nervously like most first-timers. She simply stepped forward and stood quietly near the edge of the mat, her eyes calm, observant, taking in every movement without a word. Master Ryan noticed immediately. Of course he did. He always did. But instead of welcoming her, his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. Not cruel, not overt, but enough to signal judgment already forming. He turned slightly toward instructor Blake Turner, who stood nearby with arms crossed, and murmured just loud enough for a few students to hear. Another one who thinks this is a fitness class. Blake chuckled under his breath, the sound light but carrying, and just like that, the tone was set. A ripple of quiet amusement spread through the room. Not loud enough to break discipline, but enough to isolate her. Enough to mark her as an outsider before she had even spoken a single word. Emily didn't react, not to the laughter, not to the glances, not even when a pair of students near the back exchanged whispers and subtle grins. Instead, her attention remained fixed on the training floor, watching a sequence of kicks executed by a senior student. Her gaze steady, focused, almost analytical, as if she wasn't just watching, but understanding, breaking down every movement piece by piece. The precision, the timing, the control, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible shifted in her expression, not pride, not intimidation, something quieter, something deeper, but it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. You here to sign up? Blake's voice cut through the room as he approached her, his tone polite on the surface, but edged with skepticism. Emily turned slightly, meeting his gaze with calm composure. Just observing for now, she replied softly, her voice even, controlled. Blake raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at Ryan before letting out a short breath. We don't really do observation sessions, he said, gesturing loosely toward the floor. This is a serious training environment. His words hung in the air, not aggressive, but dismissive enough to draw attention. Several students slowed again, watching, waiting, sensing the tension beginning to build. Ryan stepped forward then, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The subtle murmurs faded, the room tightening around his authority. He stopped a few feet from Emily, looking her up and down in a quick, practiced assessment. We train fighters here, he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying just enough volume for others to hear. Not spectators. A pause followed, brief but deliberate. Long enough for the implication to settle in, long enough for the room to lean into the moment. And in that silence, something unspoken began to form, a challenge waiting to be acknowledged, a line quietly drawn between what they believed they were seeing and what they were about to discover. The room did not move, but the tension did, tightening like a drawn line no one wanted to cross first. Master Ryan's words lingered in the air, firm and deliberate, and for a moment it seemed like that would be the end of it, just another quiet dismissal. Another outsider turned away without incident. But Emily did not step back, did not apologize, did not explain herself. She simply stood there, her posture relaxed yet grounded, her gaze steady as if she had heard something entirely different from what everyone else had heard. Around them, the students resumed their drills, but the rhythm was no longer the same. Kicks landed slightly off beat. Focus split between movement and curiosity, because something about her refusal to react felt unusual, almost unsettling, as if she was not intimidated, not offended, just present in a way that did not match the situation. Blake exhaled slowly, shifting his weight as he glanced toward Ryan again, waiting for a cue, and when none came, he stepped closer to Emily, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to hide the edge beneath it. Look, if you are serious about training, you start with basics, beginner classes, scheduled sessions, not just walking in and watching like this. He gestured lightly toward the floor. People here have put in years of work. His tone carried that familiar boundary, the invisible line between those who belonged and those who did not. Emily nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, her eyes drifting briefly to a pair of advanced students practicing a fast combination across the mat, their movements sharp, precise, yet something in her expression suggested she was noticing details others were not, small inconsistencies, slight imbalances, things that only someone deeply familiar would recognize. And that quiet observation did not go unnoticed by Ryan. He studied her more carefully now, the faint smirk gone, replaced by something more measured, more curious, because there was a difference between confidence and calm, and she carried the latter in a way that did not ask for attention, did not demand validation, it simply existed. You think you understand what you are looking at, Ryan said finally, his voice even, but with a subtle weight behind it, enough to draw the attention of nearby students again. Most people do not. A few students slowed their drills once more, sensing the shift, sensing that this was no longer just about a newcomer. This was becoming something else. Emily turned her gaze back to him, meeting his eyes without hesitation. I am still learning, she said quietly, and for a split second, the answer seemed simple, almost disarming, but there was something in the way she said it, something steady, something that did not match the humility of the words. And that contradiction landed harder than any argument could have. A student near the edge of the mat raised his phone slightly higher, pretending to check a message but clearly recording. Another leaned in closer, whispering under his breath, anticipation building in small, subtle ways that spread through the room like a current. Blake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Everyone is learning, he said, louder now, letting the words carry. But there is a difference between watching and doing. He stepped back, opening a small space on the mat with a casual gesture that was anything but casual. If you are here, then show us something. The words landed softly, but the implication was sharp, a challenge wrapped in politeness, the kind designed to expose, to confirm what they already believed. The room shifted again, drills slowing to a near stop, attention converging, not openly, not breaking discipline, but enough that the energy changed, enough that the air felt heavier, charged with expectation. Emily did not move immediately. She looked at the open space, then at Blake, then briefly at Ryan, as if measuring more than just the distance between them, as if calculating something unseen, and in that pause, the silence deepened, stretching just long enough to make a few students exchange glances, to make someone in the back mutter quietly, "She is going to back out." But Emily stepped forward instead, one simple step onto the mat, her sneakers soft against the surface, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, and for the first time since she walked in, the room felt completely still. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even Blake's expression shifted slightly, just enough to register that something was not unfolding the way he expected. Ryan folded his arms, watching closely now, not dismissive anymore, not amused, just focused, because whatever was about to happen, it was no longer just a joke. And somewhere beneath the surface, a quiet realization began to form, something none of them were ready to say out loud yet, but all of them could feel. The line had been crossed, and there was no stepping back. The silence did not break when she stepped onto the mat. It deepened, stretching across the polished floor as if the entire room was holding its breath at the same time, waiting for something they could not yet define. And in that stillness, Emily Carter stood without urgency, without tension, her shoulders loose, her hands relaxed at her sides, not in a formal stance, not in anything that resembled what the students had been trained to expect, and that alone created the first ripple of confusion. Blake let out a short exhale, masking uncertainty with a faint smile as he stepped forward to meet her, his posture confident, practiced, the kind of presence built from years of repetition and reinforcement. "We will keep this simple," he said, his tone light, but controlled, as if explaining something obvious. "Just show us what you think you know." A few students shifted slightly, adjusting their positions to get a clearer view. One phone raised a little higher now, capturing every second. Because whatever this was, it was no longer routine. Emily nodded once, her eyes briefly scanning the space between them, not measuring distance the way a beginner would, but observing angles, balance, rhythm, the small details that often went unnoticed. And when she finally lifted her hands, it was not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a quiet, natural motion, her posture settling into something that did not look impressive, but felt unmistakably stable, grounded in a way that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Blake stepped in first, controlled and deliberate, his movement clean, his form precise, designed not to harm, but to test, to demonstrate control. Yet before his motion fully completed, Emily shifted, a small step to the side, almost effortless, her timing so exact that it seemed less like a reaction and more like she had anticipated it before it began, and in that single moment, the room changed. A student near the back lowered his phone slightly, his brows narrowing, trying to understand what he had just seen, because nothing about it had been dramatic, and yet something about it felt completely different. Blake adjusted quickly, maintaining composure, continuing with a second controlled movement, but again, Emily moved, not fast in the way people expected speed, but efficient, her motion minimal, precise, removing herself from the line of contact with a calm that made it look almost simple, and that simplicity was what unsettled the room the most. No wasted energy, no hesitation, just quiet certainty, the soft sound of feet against. The mat echoed more clearly now, each shift amplified by the silence that had taken over the dojo. Even the students who had been whispering before were now completely still, their attention locked in place, because what they were watching no longer matched the narrative they had created in their minds. Blake paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for doubt to flicker across his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but real, and Emily saw it, not with satisfaction, not with pride, but with the same calm awareness she had carried since she walked in. She did not press forward, did not escalate. She simply returned to stillness, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if inviting the next move without demanding it. The room felt smaller now, tighter, every eye focused, every assumption quietly unraveling piece by piece. Master Ryan, who had remained still until now, leaned forward slightly, his arms still crossed, but his gaze sharpened, no longer dismissive, no longer casual. He was studying her now, truly studying her, because what he was seeing did not fit into any of the categories he was used to, and that uncertainty carried weight. Blake stepped back half a pace, resetting. But this time there was no smirk, no casual confidence, only concentration, and when he moved again, it was more careful, more deliberate, yet the result was the same. Emily adjusted with minimal motion, maintaining balance, maintaining control, never overcommitting, never revealing more than necessary, and that restraint spoke louder than any display of force ever could. A quiet murmur almost formed somewhere in the room, but it died before becoming sound, replaced instead by something heavier, something closer to realization, and in that suspended moment, one thought began to take shape across multiple minds at once. Unspoken but undeniable. They were no longer watching a beginner trying to keep up, they were watching someone who had been holding back the entire time. And the room knew it. The shift was no longer subtle, it was undeniable, and everyone in the room felt it at the same time, like a quiet truth rising to the surface that no one could ignore anymore. Because Blake was no longer leading, he was reacting, and that alone changed everything. His movements, once confident and instructive, had become measured, cautious, as if he was now the one trying to understand what stood in front of him and across from him, Emily remained exactly the same, steady, composed, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, not showing off, not escalating, just present in a way that made every small motion feel deliberate. A faint sound echoed as someone near the back shifted their footing, the kind of noise that would normally go unnoticed, but now it cut through the silence like a signal, reminding everyone just how quiet the room had become. Master Ryan straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in frustration, but in focus, the kind of focus reserved for moments when something important is unfolding, something worth paying attention to, because what he was seeing now was not luck, not coincidence, it was control. Blake moved again, slower this time, more precise, attempting to regain the rhythm he had lost, but Emily adjusted before the movement fully formed, her step light, almost effortless, her timing exact in a way that made it seem like she was not following his actions, but reading them before they happened, and that realization landed hard, not just on Blake, but on everyone watching. A student near the front lowered his hand slightly, his usual stance forgotten, his eyes fixed on the space between them, trying to process the difference between what he had been taught and what he was now witnessing. There was no wasted motion in Emily's response, no unnecessary energy, just clarity, and that clarity began to feel overwhelming in its simplicity. Blake paused again, longer this time, his composure still intact, but the ease gone, replaced by concentration that bordered on uncertainty, and in that pause, Emily did something unexpected. She relaxed further, her hands lowering slightly, her stance softening, not as a sign of weakness, but as if she was giving him space, offering him control of the moment without actually surrendering it. And that quiet decision spoke louder than anything she could have said. The room felt it immediately. This was no longer a test of skill, it was a shift in understanding. Ryan uncrossed his arms for the first time, his attention fully locked in, his earlier assumptions dissolving piece by piece, replaced by something far more serious, respect forming not from words, but from observation. Blake took a breath, resetting once more, but this time there was hesitation, just a fraction, just enough to reveal that the balance had changed, and when he moved again, it was careful, deliberate, yet the result remained unchanged. Emily adjusted with the same quiet precision, her movements controlled, efficient, never overextending, never forcing anything, and that restraint created a new kind of tension, one that did not rely on speed or power, but on inevitability. A phone slipped slightly in someone's hand, the soft sound barely audible, but in that silence, it felt amplified, as if the entire room was reacting to something none of them could yet put into words. Blake stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, his eyes narrowing as he studied her now, truly studied her, and for the first time, he did not look at her as an outsider, but as someone he did not understand. Emily remained still, her gaze calm, her presence unchanged, offering no explanation, no hint of intention, and that absence of explanation was what unsettled them the most, because it forced them to confront the only conclusion left. She had never been trying to prove anything. She had been holding back, and as that realization settled into the room, heavier than any sound, Master Ryan took a single step forward, his voice quieter now, but carrying more weight than before. "Who trained you?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a question that acknowledged something undeniable, and for the first time since she walked in, every single person in that dojo leaned in, waiting for an answer they were not prepared to hear. The question did not echo, but it settled into the room with a weight that pressed against every person standing there, because it was no longer about curiosity, it was about recognition, and everyone knew it. Emily did not answer right away. She did not rush to fill the silence or offer an explanation. Instead, she held Ryan's gaze with the same quiet steadiness she had carried from the moment she stepped inside, and that pause alone shifted the power in the room once more, because now it was not them evaluating her, it was them waiting on her. A student near the wall adjusted his stance unconsciously, the habit of discipline clashing with the distraction of uncertainty, while another lowered his phone completely, no longer recording, as if whatever this moment was, it felt too real to watch through a screen. Ryan took another small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but intentional, his posture no longer that of a man asserting authority, but but of someone trying to understand something he could not easily categorize. "You are not a beginner," he said, his voice quieter now, measured, and this time it was not a statement meant to challenge. It was a conclusion already reached. Blake remained where he stood, his breathing controlled but slightly heavier than before, his focus fixed entirely on Emily, replaying every movement in his mind, searching for the detail he had missed, the moment he had lost control of the exchange. But there was no single point to find, no obvious mistake, just a gradual realization that had unfolded without warning. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry across the silent room. "I did not come here to prove anything," she said, and the simplicity of the words made them land harder than any explanation could have, because they stripped away every assumption that had been placed on her since she walked in. A faint shift moved through the students, not noise, not conversation, but awareness, the kind that spreads when people begin to understand they have misjudged something important. Ryan studied her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in focus. "Then why come at all?" he asked, and this time there was no edge in his tone, only genuine curiosity, the kind that comes when certainty is no longer an option. Emily's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the rows of students, the polished floor, the mirrored walls that reflected everything back at them, and for a moment, something almost reflective passed through her expression, as if she was seeing more than just the present moment, as if she was remembering something that had brought her there in the first place. "Because this place matters," she said quietly, and that answer created a different kind of silence, one that did not come from tension, but from meaning. Blake's brow furrowed slightly, confusion replacing the last traces of skepticism, because that was not the answer he expected, not the explanation that fit the narrative he had built in his head. Ryan exhaled slowly, his posture shifting just enough to signal that whatever this was, it had moved beyond a simple interaction. "Who trained you?" he repeated, but softer this time, less of a demand, more of an invitation, and the room leaned in again, every person present aware that whatever she said next would define everything they thought they understood about her. Emily looked back at him, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, and for a brief second, it seemed like she might answer directly. But instead, she offered something else, something that carried more weight than a name ever could. "Different places," she said, and the words were simple, almost understated. But there was something in the way she said them, something that suggested experience beyond a single school, beyond a single teacher, something earned over time rather than given. A quiet realization settled across Ryan's face, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to shift his perspective, enough to recognize that whatever path she had taken, it was not one he could easily trace. The room remained still, but the energy had changed again, no longer tense, no longer expectant, but reflective, as if everyone present was reevaluating not just her, but themselves, their assumptions, their definitions of skill, of experience, of what it meant to truly understand something. Emily stepped back slightly then, her movement small, controlled, signaling that she was done, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in completion, as if the moment had already said everything it needed to say. And as she did, the silence lingered just a second longer, heavy and undeniable, before the reality of what had just happened began to settle in fully, and no one in that room would see the next moment the same way again. No one spoke when she stepped back, and somehow that silence carried more weight than anything that had happened before it, because it was no longer about what she could do. It was about what they had just witnessed, and more importantly, what they had failed to see from the beginning. The room remained still, the polished floor reflecting the frozen posture of students who had forgotten their drills entirely, their attention no longer divided, but fixed completely on Emily Carter, the quiet girl who had walked in unnoticed and now stood at the center of something none of them could explain. Blake lowered his hands slowly, his stance dissolving not from exhaustion, but from understanding, his eyes no longer searching for a mistake, but acknowledging that there had never been one to find, and that realization settled deeper than any physical outcome ever could. Master Ryan stood a few feet away, his posture composed but changed, the authority he carried still present, yet now tempered by something far more important, awareness. And for a man who had spent decades teaching others to read movement, to understand timing, to recognize discipline, this moment carried a lesson he had not expected to receive. Emily did not linger in the spotlight, did not shift her posture to claim attention. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, calm, grounded, her presence unchanged by the shift around her, and that consistency made everything else feel louder by comparison. A student near the front finally exhaled, a small sound that broke the stillness just enough to remind everyone they were still in the same room, still standing on the same floor, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Ryan took a slow breath, his gaze steady on Emily. "You held back," he said quietly, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as an observation that had become impossible to ignore, and the weight of those words spread through the room immediately, because everyone felt it. Everyone had sensed it without fully understanding it until now. Emily met his gaze, her expression calm, almost reflective, and she gave a small nod, not confirming superiority, not asserting anything beyond what was already clear, and that simple acknowledgement carried more humility than any explanation could have. Blake let out a quiet breath, stepping back fully now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more honest, respect forming not from defeat, but from recognition, and around them, the students began to shift, not returning to their drills, but adjusting their perspective, the subtle change in posture, in expression, in the way they looked at her, all reflecting the same realization taking hold. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in thought, as if he was replaying every moment from the beginning, every word, every assumption, every quiet dismissal, and measuring it against what he now understood, and for a brief second, something almost unspoken passed through his expression, the recognition that the lesson in the room had not belonged to him. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, his voice steady, but softer than before, and this question landed differently, because it was not about her skill anymore. It was about her choice, her silence, her decision to let everything unfold without interference. Emily's gaze moved briefly across the room again, taking in the students, the instructors, the environment that had defined itself so clearly before she arrived, and she answered without hesitation. Because people listen differently when they see for themselves, and the simplicity of that answer settled into the space like truth, undeniable, unforced, leaving no room for argument. The room went quiet again, but this time it was not tense, it was reflective, each person standing in that space processing not just what had happened, but what it meant, and as that understanding began to take root, the dynamic of the entire room shifted in a way that could not be undone. Ryan straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not to its original form. There was something different now, something grounded in respect rather than assumption, and for the first time since she had walked in, he gave a small nod, not as a gesture of authority, but as recognition, a silent acknowledgement of what stood in front of him. Emily returned the nod just as simply, her movement minimal, her expression unchanged, and without another word, she turned slightly, her footsteps soft against the mat as she began to move toward the edge of the room, not waiting for permission, not seeking validation, just leaving the same way she had entered, quietly, without disruption, yet leaving something behind that would not fade quickly. And as she reached the edge of the mat, one thought lingered in the minds of everyone watching, heavier than anything spoken aloud. They had not just underestimated her, they had misunderstood what true mastery looked like all along. The door did not close loudly when she left, but somehow the soft click echoed through the entire dojo like a final note that refused to fade, and for a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if breaking that silence too quickly would erase something they were all still trying to understand. The students stood where they were, their postures no longer rigid with discipline, but loosened by reflection, eyes drifting toward the entrance where Emily Carter had disappeared, as if expecting her to walk back in and explain what had just happened, to give them something they could label, categorize, and place neatly within the structure they had been taught to trust. But she did not return, and that absence made the moment feel even more real. Blake exhaled slowly, lowering his arms completely now, his shoulders dropping in a way that revealed something deeper than fatigue. It was recognition, the kind that does not come from losing, but from realizing you had misunderstood the entire situation from the start. He glanced briefly at Ryan, searching for something, perhaps confirmation, perhaps guidance. But what he found instead was something he had never seen before, not in this room, not from this man. Master Ryan was still standing exactly where he had been, but his presence had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. The rigid certainty that once defined him now softened by thought. His gaze no longer fixed on control, but on reflection, as if he was replaying every detail, every word spoken, every assumption made, and weighing it against what had just unfolded in front of him. A student near the back finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Was she an instructor somewhere else? The question hung in the air, uncertain, incomplete, because it did not fully capture what they had witnessed. It was an attempt to simplify something that refused to be simplified. Another student shook his head slightly. It felt different, he said, and that was all he could manage, because there were no easy words for what they had just seen, no simple explanation that fit comfortably within the boundaries of their training. Ryan finally moved, a small step forward, his hands resting at his sides, his posture still composed, but no longer rigid. "Line up," he said quietly, and the tone was enough, not commanding, not forceful, but steady, and the students responded immediately, forming their rows with practiced precision. Yet something in their movement had changed. It was still disciplined, still controlled, but now there was an awareness woven into it, a subtle shift that could not be undone. Blake took his place as well, his earlier confidence replaced by focus, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have more to learn than they thought. Ryan walked slowly along the line, his eyes moving from one student to the next, not correcting their stance, not adjusting their form, just observing. And when he spoke again, his voice carried differently, not louder, but deeper. "What you saw today," he began, pausing just long enough for every person in the room to listen fully, "was not about technique." The words settled in carefully, each one measured, deliberate. "It was about understanding," he continued. "Understanding movement, understanding timing, understanding restraint." He stopped at the center of the room, turning slightly so that everyone could see him clearly. "And more than anything, understanding that skill does not always look the way you expect it." 2. The room remained silent, but this time it was not from tension, it was from attention, every student absorbing the words in a way they had not before. Blake nodded subtly, his expression thoughtful, the lesson landing not as instruction, but as realization. Ryan's gaze shifted briefly toward the door, where Emily had exited, and for a moment, something almost unspoken passed through his eyes, not regret, but recognition, the kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed. "We start again," he said finally, and the students moved into position, their movements sharper now, more intentional, but beneath that precision was something new, something quieter, a respect not just for the practice, but for what they had witnessed. And as the first synchronized step echoed across the floor once more, one truth lingered in the room, steady and undeniable. The strongest presence is often the one that never needs to announce itself. The rhythm of the room returned, but it was not the same rhythm they had known before. Every movement now carried intention, every step grounded in a new awareness that had not existed just an hour earlier. And even though the drills resumed, something lingered beneath the surface, something quiet and persistent that refused to be ignored. The sound of feet striking the mat echoed in steady patterns, but between those sounds, there were glances, brief and subtle, exchanged between students who were all thinking the same thing, but not yet ready to say it out loud. Blake moved along the line, correcting a stance here, adjusting a position there, but his tone had changed, less automatic, more deliberate, as if each correction now carried a deeper meaning than just technique, and every so often, his eyes would drift toward the entrance, just for a second, before returning to the present moment. Master Ryan stood at the front, observing as he always had, but his presence felt different now, not diminished, not uncertain, but refined, sharpened by something he had not anticipated. And as he watched his students move, he saw details he had overlooked before, small inefficiencies, moments of imbalance, habits that had gone unchallenged because they had never been questioned deeply enough. "Again," he said, his voice steady, and the students repeated the sequence, their movements tighter this time, more focused, but still searching, still adjusting. as if trying to reach something they could not quite define. A young student in the second row hesitated mid-movement, just for a fraction of a second, then corrected himself, his brow slightly furrowed, and that small moment did not go unnoticed. Ryan stepped closer, watching carefully, then spoke, not with correction, but with a question. "What are you thinking?" The student blinked, caught off guard, then answered honestly. "I am trying to get it perfect." Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "And what if perfect is not what you think it is?" The words settled into the space, not as instruction, but as an invitation to reconsider, and the student straightened slightly, absorbing the idea in a way that felt different from the usual corrections he had received. Across the room, another student shifted his stance, adjusting his balance, testing something new, something quieter, less forceful, and when he moved again, it was smoother, more controlled, and he paused for a moment, surprised by the difference, as if he had discovered something on his own. Blake noticed and gave a small nod, not of approval, but of recognition, understanding that the lesson unfolding now was not one that could be taught directly. It had to be experienced. The air in the dojo felt lighter, but also deeper, layered with a kind of focus that went beyond repetition, and even the mirrors along the walls seemed to reflect something more than just form. They reflected awareness, reflection, growth. Ryan stepped back to the center of the room, his eyes moving across the students once more, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet weight. "Strength is not always visible," he said, pausing briefly, "and mastery is not always loud." The students remained still, listening, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand, truly understand, and in that moment, the dojo felt less like a place of instruction and more like a place of discovery. A faint breeze moved through the open doorway, barely noticeable, but enough to remind them of the world outside, the same world where someone could walk in unnoticed and leave without explanation, yet change everything in between. Blake glanced once more toward the door, then back to the students, his expression settled, focused, no longer questioning what had happened, but accepting what it meant. "Continue," Ryan said quietly, and the students moved again. But this time, there was no rush, no need to impress, just the steady pursuit of something deeper than before, something they had only just begun to understand. And as the rhythm of the room carried forward, one quiet truth remained, not spoken, but present in every movement. Sometimes the greatest lesson is the one that is never announced, only realized. The evening settled slowly over the dojo as the final sequence came to an end, the last synchronized movement landing with a soft, unified sound that echoed briefly before fading into a calm, steady silence. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were waiting for instruction, but because something about the stillness felt complete, as if the room itself had reached a quiet understanding. The overhead lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, mirroring rows of students who now stood differently than they had before, their posture still disciplined, but no longer rigid, their focus no longer fixed on perfection, but on awareness, and that subtle change could be seen in the smallest details, in the way they breathed, in the way they held their balance, in the way they looked at each other. Master Ryan walked slowly across the front of the room, his steps measured, his presence steady, but the authority he carried now felt different, not diminished, but refined, grounded in something deeper than routine. And as he turned to face the students, his gaze moved across them not as individuals to correct, but as learners in a moment that could not be repeated. "That is enough for today," he said quietly, and the words landed gently, without urgency, without command, just a simple acknowledgement that the training had reached its natural end. The students bowed in unison, their movements precise, but this time there was something more behind it, something quieter, a respect that extended beyond the usual formality, and as they straightened, no one rushed to leave. No one spoke immediately, as if they all understood that something meaningful had happened and it deserved a moment of silence before being broken apart by conversation. Blake stepped forward slightly, his hands resting at his sides, his expression thoughtful, and after a brief pause, he spoke, not to instruct, but to reflect. "We spend years trying to be seen as strong," he said, his voice calm. But sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who does not need to be seen at all. A few students nodded subtly, the words resonating in a way that felt personal, not abstract. Ryan remained still for a moment longer, then added quietly, "And sometimes, the lesson you need most is not the one you came here to learn." And with that, he gave a small nod, signaling dismissal, but it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation of something that would carry beyond the walls of the dojo. The students began to gather their things slowly, movements quieter than usual, conversations softer, more thoughtful, as if each person was still processing the shift that had taken place. And as they moved toward the exit, several of them glanced once more at the door, the same door she had walked through earlier, the same door she had left without hesitation, and though it looked no different, it felt like something important had passed through it. Blake lingered near the center of the room, his eyes tracing the space where everything had unfolded, replaying the moment not with frustration, but with clarity, understanding now that what he had witnessed was not something to challenge, but something to learn from. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself a quiet breath, letting that realization settle. Ryan turned toward the mirrors along the wall, his reflection staring back at him. And for the first time in a long time, he did not look for flaws in posture or alignment. He looked for something else, something less visible, something that could not be measured or corrected. And as he stood there, a faint expression crossed his face. Not regret, not pride, but acknowledgement. Outside, the sky had shifted to a soft evening glow, the light fading gradually. And somewhere beyond the glass, life continued as it always had, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place inside those walls. And as the last student stepped out and the door closed gently behind them, the dojo returned to stillness. But it was not the same stillness it had known before. It carried something with it now, something subtle but lasting, a reminder that true mastery is not defined by what others see, but by what remains when there is nothing left to prove. And on that day, without raising her voice, without seeking attention, without staying to explain, Emily Carter had left behind a lesson that no one in that room would ever forget.